Now, that aside, today's show, I'm joined by maybe the most accomplished person in comics that I probably have ever had on the podcast, which is no disrespect to any of my past guests, co-hosts, or anyone for that matter. My statement is more indicative of the level of success, respect, and accomplishments this person has had working in the comic book industry for the last 20 plus years. His name is Chris Ryall, and he's best known for being the former president, publisher, chief creative officer, and editor-in-chief of IDW Publishing from June 2004 to 2019. That's about 15 years of that 20-plus year career at one of the most premier comic publishers, just top dog in all aspects. During his tenure at IDW, he helped develop hundreds of original properties as both editor and writer, and he helped form important partnerships between IDW and some really high-profile licensors such as Hasbro, Nickelodeon, Lucasfilm, and a whole bunch more. He also worked with creators Joe Hill, who was a Shortbox alumni. He was on the show last year and actually spoke very highly about Chris. But Chris has worked with creators Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez in the development of Locke Key, serving as the editor on the comic series and as an executive producer on all 3 seasons on the Netflix adaptation. He's also a well-respected and award-winning writer himself. In January 2022, he teamed up with the acclaimed comic creator Ashley Wood to start the Syzygy Publishing line, which is an imprint of Image Comics. Chris is the writer and co-creator of Syzygy titles such as Zombies vs. Robots, Onyx, The Hollows, and Tales of Suspense. Ooh, a lot of going on here.
Yeah.
He's on the podcast today to talk about his new book, The Mighty Marvel Calendar Book, Visual History. It's a stunning 272-page hardcover book that collects and brings together the full set of Marvel calendars, which were originally published from 1975 to 1981, and is collected here for the first time in this deluxe oversized edition. If you're a diehard Marvel Comics fan or an aspiring or amateur Marvel historian like myself, this is a must-have for you. And the holidays are right around the corner, so this is an easy stocking stuffer, Christmas gift, whatever it may be, to go ahead and put on your list. The Mighty Marvel Calendar Book is available anywhere you get your books and at local comic shops. I know where I'm picking mine up at. It's at Gotham City Limited. It should be in the shop right now as I'm recording, by the time this episode comes out. Look, with all that said, that's what we're getting into today, all right? We're talking about a long tenure at IDW. We're talking about this Mighty Marvel Calendar Book and anything else that we find ourselves into. So without further ado, Shortbox Nation, let's welcome Chris Ryall to the show. Whoa.
Man, what an intro. I don't know that there's
Chris, no, we gotta let the applause play for you, buddy. Sorry, I had that on. Dude. Chris, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Man, I'm doing great. I don't know that there's anything more to say. That intro was perfect on its own. Thank you for that.
I'm like, Chris, have a good night. Thank you for coming through. Awesome interview.
You summed it up perfectly. That was great. Thanks.
We covered everything. Chris, I guess my first question to you is, actually, you know what? Before I even dive in, how are you doing today? All right. I know it's been a crazy week, to say the very least, this week. We're recording on a very interesting week of all weeks. All right. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I mean, I'm probably, I don't know how is anybody doing right now? Like, there's a certain segment that is celebrating this week, but the rest of us are kind of spending the week wallowing in just the, we don't want to get political here or anything, but I'm wallowing in the fact that we just made another terrible self-defeating decision that is just going to lead to so many unintended and intended awful things for a lot of groups of people that I just don't know how we're still here. So how I'm doing is trying to keep my head in comics and old comics and just stuff that makes me feel good and be around people like you and other people in the comic industry that are inventive and creative and empathetic. And so all of that is how I'm trying to feel good about what we're doing and where we're headed. So if that's any answer.
No, I think that sums it up perfectly. I've definitely been in my head this week, but you know what has made me happy and excited is preparing for this interview and going down the rabbit hole that is your career. And my first question for you is, what's harder, being a comic writer, an editor-in-chief, a publisher, a chief creative officer, or an executive producer on a Netflix show? What's harder? Do you have a personal favorite role that you've had throughout your career?
Well, so it's funny, like the easiest thing, but also the least paying, as an unpaid thing, was the editor-in-chief role on
Oh wow.
the Locke Key series. So there were executive producers who were sort of hands-on and on set every day and sort of doing all the things that, well, some executive producers do, and I was more of a credit than I was anything else. So I was reading through the scripts and offering bits of feedback here and there, but it was not a challenging thing. It was mostly just trying to ensure whatever level of consistency and adherence to the rules and the universe that was set up in the comic series, in the TV show. Understanding they need to make it their own thing, but just trying to be that connective tissue between the comic and the
Hmm.
TV show. I mean, I think the hardest part of the different roles I've had was publisher, because that kind of pulls you the farthest away from the actual parts of the job that I like, which is developing books and working with creators on books and figuring out the direction of titles that we're publishing and figuring out what we're going to do next, or what the publishing line is going to consist of. Whereas the publisher role is kind of a more nuts and bolts, like, all right, well, how do we maximize these opportunities? How do we sell these books in the most markets? How do we find ways to get the books into people's hands? But it kind of removes you from the creative process, which is, I think, where I sort of do my best work and also where I enjoy being the most.
And I guess
So
just for
yeah.
like, and I guess just for I always like to treat this show, as like an introductory in case anyone that maybe just has press play and they're not too familiar with comics but are curious about it. In layman's term, how would you describe the difference in roles between an editor in chief versus a publisher versus a CCO in terms of like a comic company? I work for a um, marketing department, so I'm familiar with like what our CCO does, our chief creative officer. But I'm curious, like if there's any overlap with what they might do what one might do in a comic for a comic publisher.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because it's very different. Even probably from publisher to publisher is very different. I'm sure CB Cebulski, as Marvel's editor in chief, has a different scope of responsibilities than I had as editor in chief at IDW. But effectively, so when I started there in 2004, I started as the editor in chief, but I was also the only editor on staff. And so I was sort of doing all parts of things. I was, working with the writers on the scripts, and I was working with the artists and getting the art in, moving it to an inker or a colorist and letterer, and you're sort of more in the trenches when you're the editor in chief. Like, at least I was more hands on the direct making of the comics. Sort of going up from there, like the chief creative officer is more of a bigger picture focus on like the broader publishing line. Like, here's what we're doing for this year. What's our next 3 years look like? What do we want to be publishing? Who do we want to be in business with? um, what partnerships do we want to form with places like you mentioned, like Hasbro and Lucasfilm and Marvel and others? And so you're kind of building and maintaining those relationships and figuring out at a higher level like what that publishing line is going to look like with each of them. Um, and so it's more of the 30,000 foot view of the publishing line, and then the publisher is sort of doing bits of that, but also having a more direct role in figuring out like what are the best ways to elevate these books once we've made them. How do we get them into the world? What is our presence, I don't know, at conventions and sort of the foreign sales and digital and all of those kind of distribution ends of things on top of the publishing line itself. So again, it kind of gets you away from the working directly with creators and the making of stuff, and more of like the pushing that stuff once it's made out into the world.
Wow. Okay. Now, Chris, according to I guess staying on the topic of the different hats that you've worn throughout your career and throughout, like, in the comic industry, according to your wiki, you have a lot of firsts. Like the amount of first time, et cetera, that I could find was really impressive. And that's why I said earlier on, that you're one of the most accomplished folks I've had on the show. I want to list off some of these first, and then I want to ask you a question about it. But this comes from your Wikipedia on top of some other things I found. But on your long list of first, I've got you were IDW's first chief creative officer. That was 2010. You
Yes.
were an editor-in-chief for Kevin Smith's very early website, early 2000s, moviepoopshoot.com, which is so funny as hell to say, which was his first. Now, technically, it's not like a first, but it was Kevin Smith's first foray outside of like just doing movies and films. So you got that
Yeah,
new
and
credit.
that one was like, it started for him as a goof. Like, it was a parody site in one of his movies, in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. So he wanted me to basically take that, because it was an established name within the movie. He wanted me to turn it into like a legitimate pop culture portal with comic, movie, TV, music, news, all in one place. You're sort of handcuffed by the name to some degree. So like, it took some work to sort of make people realize we were legitimate. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
You're like, you're in a room at a round table with actors and whatnot, and there's somebody from Variety, there's somebody from, I don't know, Ain't It Cool News, and somebody from Hollywood Reporter. And I'm from Movie Poop Shoot, and everybody kind of raises their eyebrow and goes, "Well, how'd he get in the room?" So it took a little bit of time to like establish ourselves as a legitimate thing, and not the site that it was in the movie, which was just like a shit talking parody site. And so it was a good, like, it was fun. Certainly that's Kevin Smith's brand. And so it was a good learning experience on how to present ourselves in ways that get us taken seriously despite that name.
No, look, moviepoopshoot.com. You can hang your hat on that. All right. That's a strong CV bullet point right there for the resume. All right.
Yeah.
So you got that. Among the other list of first that you got, you co-wrote with Simon Furman, who I had on the show just last week. He was last episode's guest of honor. So it's a kind of cool full circle moment. But you co-wrote with Simon Furman the first Transformers film prequel. It says here that during your tenure at IDW, the publisher was made a premier publisher, won their first Eisner Award under your tenure. It doesn't list actually what was the first Eisner Award. Is it safe to assume that was probably for like Locke Key or something?
No, man, that's a great question. What the first one was, I don't know. Like, I was there only about 2 years after the company started publishing, and so it was the first Eisner, but there wasn't that much material before I started that was, submitted to the Eisners. And so, yes, it was first, but, which isn't to take anything away from the previous guy, Jeff Marriott, who was the first editor-in-chief there. He just didn't have as many titles to submit. But I don't remember what it was. I know we won for like Little Nemo and Slumberland with Gabriel Rodriguez, but that would have been some point after. I don't know what the first one is. Certainly Scott Doombeer has racked up 1001 Artist Edition Eisners and other such awards. But yeah, so anyway, it was nice to at least whatever it was to preside over it. And I'm also impressed that right now the wiki information seems like it's pretty accurate. So that's good.
Big shout out to this anonymous wiki writer.
Yeah.
Okay, what else did I got here? So we got that. Under your tenure at IDW, published the first ever inter-licensed crossover. They don't go into what it was exactly. And the first ever Doctor Who crossover. Any thoughts on that? Or anything come to mind?
The former was Infestation, which was, for a while I'd wanted, because as a kid, like I grew up reading crossovers and loving that kind of thing. And then for a while, Marvel and DC stopped doing that. And so I thought, well, I want to see if I can make some of that stuff happen. We've got, at this point, had Hasbro, we had Transformers and G.I. Joe, we had Star Trek, we had Ghostbusters, and a number of other licenses. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to pull all of those into one storyline? And it took like a year to convince all those different licensors, like why they should play well with others, why they should. I mean, it sort of gets too much behind the curtain, but like why they should split royalties with all these others, because instead of a full Transformers comic gives them their full royalty, whereas if it's a crossover, they're splitting it with, the Sony who owns Ghostbusters, or, CBS, Paramount who owns Star Trek and all of that. So it really did take about a year to convince them that, well, sometimes you do things because they're fun and the fans would dig it, and it sort of like elevates all the brands at once. And so, it took some doing and some talking, but like once Hasbro agreed, then the others were like, oh, okay, I guess it's safe for us too.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I can only imagine like a bunch of men in suit, like old dusty men in suits and ties, scratching their head, and when you bring up the word fun, hey, it'd be fun. Fun? What is that?
Well, it's funny. So it's that, but it's also there are times like, well, yeah, but also like speaking of like guys in suits, or even just like corporate execs and such, we'd be sitting around meeting tables, talking about things, and you would discuss even things like, well, I don't know if we can't say shit, but can we say, so you're discussing like what level of profanity you can use, or like how are these real legitimate conversations that all these like corporate guys are getting paid to discuss. And at
Hmm.
times, like the ridiculousness of it all, like just
Yeah.
seizes you and makes you laugh. But that's kind of the fun of it too.
Yeah, I'm a little familiar with like some of those talk. I work for I work for a big insurance company, and I work in marketing, specifically brand. So we we're very protective about our logo, the way certain copy is portrayed when we do partnerships, and some of those meetings are it's just like, oh my God, why are we still talking about the smallest thing? But yeah, that's just how some of those meetings go.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
all right, what
And
else do
so
we got?
the other was the Doctor Who crossover. And so yeah, the Doctor Who had never really wanted or allowed their the different iterations of the Doctors to meet each other in one storyline. It was always like, no, the Doctor regenerated, so now it's only the Ninth Doctor, 10th Doctor. And so
Oh
we
wow.
finally found a storyline that let us bring different Doctors sort of into the same big event. And they said, we've never done this before in any form, in book form or TV or anything. And so yeah, we're allowing this to happen. So it's always fun when you can get those little victories to
Hmm.
talk them into a thing that after the fact they go, oh yeah, that was pretty fun. I don't know why we were so uptight about it. And you're like, I don't either, but see, like you can do
Yeah.
cool stuff that just makes people like you a little bit more. So
And you were doing this as a publisher, right? Like that was the role that you were in to get all these licenses and everyone to play together nicely. Was that
I
it?
mean, at that point, we didn't really have a publisher. Like the CEO of the company, Ted Adams, who's one of the
Mhm.
founders, was also the publisher. So I mean, there was such overlap between what he and I did. So there was a lot of back and forth between
Okay.
who's talking to this licensor now, what license we're going after next. But I was doing a lot of the sort of the day-to-day meetings with everybody and the pitches and
Yeah.
getting up there and Don Drapering like, here's what we would do with your stuff, and here's how
Yeah.
we would make it cool and all that. So
Well, I asked because it sounds like there's a skill there that's very important that I don't hear mentioned much when it comes to like the interviews I have of like your typical writer and artist, because it's such a kind of like a silo position that like those jobs. But versus being a little more forward facing, I guess customer facing, whatever, working with other brands and companies or whatnot, like the skill there being maybe a heavier emphasis on presentation, people skills, being able to like, talk and present and, facilitate things like that.
yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's never my comfort level to get up in front of a room and just do that. But like when you're excited about the thing and you've got cool artwork to show, and you're like,
Hmm.
no, we could make your brand better. We could make the Transformers, even more popular with these fans if we just did this. Just let us do this thing. And so then you get like real passionate about showing like why it's good for them. And I mean, for the most part, the licensors we dealt with were really great about that. Like they were sort of past the I don't know, reticence of like in the 80s when it was just like, just sell toys. We just want toys. Like
Hmm.
it's a 30-page ad for toys. We don't care about anything else but that. And now they kind of moved into this period of like, well, if the comics make us look good, that's just going to help everything. So let's tell good stories and
Yeah.
build out characters. And now like everybody also is always eyeing the movie, So like if you do comics, that's good proof of concept for the people making the films and all that. So they kind of get the story aspect in ways that they didn't used to, and so it's certainly easier to having licensors like that who kind of understand and also encourage like playfulness and inventiveness and stuff.
Speaking about playfulness, and then you also bringing up, comics being a means to sell toys as well. To go back to that Simon Furman thing, working with him to do the first Transformers film prequel. Like I said, I had a chance to interview him for the last episode, and yeah, he was extremely kind, super knowledgeable. Like I listened back to that episode, and I'm like, man, if I was more knowledgeable about Transformers lore, I could have gone down so many different rabbit holes. But I'm curious from your experience, what was it like working with Simon Furman, who I feel like is this dude is like almost underrated how like talented and important he is, to like kind of not single handedly, but you know what I mean, like to
Yeah.
build the Transformers lore that we know, to have written so many like issues of Transformers. What was it like working with, a living legend?
He's the best, like, and he's such a nice guy. Like, I love working with Simon. I love talking to Simon. I love like sitting with Simon when we'd be at conventions together and stuff. Like, the greatest guy. And you're right. Like Larry Hama sort of is rightfully praised for the way he's guided
Yeah,
GI Joe, Real
that's
American Hero, and sort
that's
of
a good one.
from its inception. Like he's what gave them characters and
Hmm.
made them characters people cared about instead of just pieces of plastic. And he's been doing that for 40 years. Simon has been working on Transformers in some form or another for decades, but I think because either Transformers didn't have as sustained a run as the Real American Heroes series did. Now it's up over 300 issues, even though it's changed a couple publishers' hands. But Larry gets talked about in ways that I think Simon also deserves to get talked about in that same sort of breath. Like Bob Budiansky was there. He was kind of the Larry Hama at the start for Marvel, helped name and define some of the characters. But Simon's the one who really breathed real life into them and just, I don't know, made the characters so much more resonant. So when we were first getting the license, you sometimes wanted to start over and start fresh and do something all new. But then you're like, no, we got to bring in Simon. Simon's the best at this. And Simon's who the fans are going to respond the best to. And so that totally proved itself out. And so then co-writing the Transformers movie prequel with him, I did it in part because I wanted to write a Transformers comic. And also it was easier, with NDAs and secrecy and everything, it was easy to keep it sort of somewhat in-house. But after about issue 1 or 2, where I, suggested a few things, and every issue Simon took a heavier hand, and I wanted him to do that because he's just better at it. And so, but it was great to just, get to work on it with him for a few issues.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of rounds out my list of first, because you mentioned the crossover Infestation, which I've got here. It paired Transformers, Star Trek, Ghostbusters, and G.I. Joe in an adventure with your own Zombies versus Robots creation, which is an epic. Just reading that out loud is epic. I'm going to have to find that and put that in my cart. But I guess after hearing, doing that little walk down memory lane, where do your ideas come from? What are you inspired by? And most importantly, what kind of lessons have you learned being the first to do so many things?
So sort of answering in reverse order. When I was a kid, I used to read licensed comics, and they were largely shitty, or they some were good, but they didn't always get the top talents because the top talents were doing Batman and Spider-Man, and the characters that these companies owned. And so they would put sort of available talent, or the talent that weren't necessarily the top at the companies at the time, to do licensed material, or like I say, they were used to sell toys. And so I wanted the licensed stuff to matter to people. I wanted it to matter as much as an issue of Spider-Man or Batman, because IDW didn't have big corporate titles and sort of well-established characters like Spider-Man as our own. We thought, well, we need to treat all these licenses as they're just as important, like they're characters we own, because that's what's going to make people care about them. And so what I learned is there's always new things to do with titles and characters, even if they've been around forever. Star Trek had been around since late 60s. They started doing comics right after the TV show in mid 60s. So there was already 35, 40 years, whatever it was, of comics before we started publishing them. But we did an episode or an issue of Klingons in the Klingon language. We had it translated to actual Klingon, and we did this Harlan Ellison story that had never been told in with his original script. Just finding new ways to sort of reinvigorate these older properties, these legacy properties, I think is a thing that I learned, that if you really care about them, you got to kind of come at it first from a point of caring. If you're doing something just because it's going to make you some money, fans are going to realize that you don't care about it, because your passion kind of comes through to them. And so that was always our initial driver, was all right, do we like this enough to want to live with it for a few years? And wait, there was a second question. Actually, there was a first question that I answered out of order, and now I've since forgotten.
That's all good. I was asking, the line of questions, where do your ideas come from? What are you inspired by?
Yeah, it's funny, because almost every comic I've written that wasn't tied in with a licensed property or a book adaptation or something involves either zombies or robots or aliens, or some combination thereof. And so, I don't know, my ideas kind of come from my interests. And I was a UFO kid, and I always liked horror novels and horror movies and things like that. And so those kind of formed the basis for all the sort of stories I want to tell. I always start out wanting to tell a story that is just characters and sort of premise and, maybe a real world setting. And then you're like, it'd be more interesting with a monster. And so you layer the genre element onto it. And so almost everything I do has that genre element added to it, because I just find that sort of more fun to play in. So I don't know, my ideas, I guess, come from the stuff I've always loved.
Now, can you recall what was the first comic book that you got a hold of, or maybe the one that made you like the one that started this journey, this fandom for you? Can you recall
I
that
can.
memory?
It's back over there. It's Fantastic Four 130, which was there were these older kids when I was like 4 years old. And these older kids down the block had these stacks of old comics all over their bedrooms, and we go play with them. And I found this Fantastic Four, and I was like, I don't know what's going on here, but they were fighting the Frightful Four. So there was like seven or
Yeah.
eight characters on the cover, and
Is
there's a flaming guy, and a guy made of rock, and a guy stretching, and a guy made of sand, and other people flying, and Medusa with her living hair, and I'm just like, I don't know what this is, but just like inject this in my veins. Like I need more of this. And so it like just immediately captivated me and sort of kickstarted this love of comics before I could even actually really read the words.
yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, that was the one. And I've still actually got that. So I stole the comic from those kids eventually because I was like, they don't appreciate this comic. They're never going to miss it. Like this shit's scattered all over their room. And so I just brought it home
casual
one day and
fans. Yeah.
yeah. So I still have it. So it's funny. I found the guy a few years ago. He tracked me down on social media, and I was like, "Hey, man, I should fess up. Like, I stole this old comic of yours, and I still have it. You want it back?" He's like, "No, man. I'm so glad I found a good home." So
That's cool. That's
yeah,
cool. Fun fact. Do you know who? Actually, I'm curious now because Chris, I have a feeling that I made a joke about being an amateur Marvel historian, but I have a feeling I'm dealing with a professional Marvel historian here. Can you recall who did the cover for this? Because I didn't know.
Jim Steranko. Oh yeah, it was
Damn
Jim
right.
Steranko and Joe Sinnott. Yeah.
Damn right. Yeah. All right. And interiors. Who was the writer and artist for this one?
The artist was John Buscema. It was John Buscema and Joe Sinnott. The writer, God, 130 was probably Jerry Conway.
I'll give
No,
you
it
a
was Roy
hint.
Thomas.
There we
No,
go.
it was
Ding, ding,
actually a
ding,
good one.
ladies and
Was it
gents.
Roy
That's
Thomas?
a good one. Yeah, you were right.
Yeah, those guys would like alternate issues all the time, and like it was weird because they had like multiple writers. They would switch every month, but there was like a consistency of tone and storytelling that you're like they all read like a completely like single entity wrote this thing, and I was always kind of amazed by that going back as an adult, and you're like it's really seamless, now when somebody else jumps onto a book like stylistically it's so different, but it was like they all kind of wrote the same. Maybe they were all just following that Stan Lee blueprint or something, but it was hard to sort of tell one from the other at that point.
Hmm. Now, I guess fast forwarding a little bit. So this Fantastic Four issue sparks that love for comics, that interest for comics. Where is the turning point for you where this becomes a viable and real career? Was it in 2002 when Kevin Smith had you be the editor for the website, or was there another point for
It was that, yeah. Like before that, I tried writing and drawing my own comics as a kid, and I realized I was a terrible artist. And then I'd write up the occasional pitches and mail them off to Marvel and DC and never hear back. Or I would enter like the Wizard magazine talent contests, just all these things that never led anywhere. And so I was writing things like ad copy and like training videos for car companies and things like that. So it was like writing, but writing I just hated. So on the side, I started writing comic reviews online. It was like sort of in the earlier days of like, I don't know, comic reviews and commentary and everything like that. And so Kevin Smith found one, sort of took exception to it, told me why my opinion was wrong. And like, we kind of went back and forth on
you?
that.
Wow.
And eventually after, yeah, a few months of just like kind of arguing and then kind of getting friendly and then joking with each other over a couple months, he asked me to run this website for him. Through the website, I met a few comic people. Most notably at the time was Steve Niles, who was IDW's big writer at the time, and he made the introduction to IDW. And so, yeah, my first job was basically editor-in-chief at IDW, thanks to Niles making that intro.
Wow, that's a really cool series of events. Now, if you had to sum up or name four comics that define your taste in comic books and storytelling and your preference when it comes to comic books, what do I need to throw in this imaginary blender to get the perfect comic for Chris Ryall?
All right, well, let me think. We didn't plan this ahead of time, so I don't have an easy answer. So just
Yeah, no.
thinking this through aloud. So my all-time favorite storyline is Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Daredevil: Born Again, which I just find is like the
Same,
high
same.
watermark of superhero comics. So I'd put that in the mix. I would probably throw Preacher in there because the kind of off-kilter dark humor of Garth Ennis's comic is certainly a thing that like I found really resonant and sort of matched my own sensibilities. I would throw Alan Moore's Swamp Thing in there for not
Nice.
necessarily the same reason, but I just find that also like he just made me sort of reconsider what comics could be, and even comics published under Marvel and DC just became something so much more in that particular series. And then God, I don't know. I guess I'd probably have to put another Marvel title in there because Fantastic Four, like from my early childhood up through like, when I went back and read the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stuff, the John Byrne stuff certainly left a big mark on me, and sort of all through my childhood, that was my favorite book just because it was
Hmm.
my first, and so it was one that always just mattered a lot to me. So I guess I'd probably throw all of those at first, but I would also have to add things like, I don't know, Ninja Turtles,
Yeah,
showing
yeah.
me that indie comics could be something so different. And like that was also a comic that made you think like, not that what they did was easy, but it made you think like, all right, well, those are just two kids doing this. Like I could maybe do that someday if I
Yeah,
really
it
apply
was
myself.
it was approachable. Like the
Yeah.
barrier to entry was like realistic at this point. It wasn't like hidden behind big publishers or gatekeepers. It was like, oh, if they can do it, respectfully, I can do it. And I think a
That's
lot of people
totally it.
ended up doing
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I think a lot of us like felt like we needed permission. We needed
Hmm.
like to send off samples and have Marvel and DC anoint us as like, you are now a comic writer. And then Kevin and Peter were like, well, we're just going to go make comics. So like, we don't
Yeah.
need their permission. And so
Yeah.
yeah, that opened a ton of doors. And I mean, there's a lot more along the way, but I think like formative years, like those are the kind of things that really left a mark on me. And so
Hmm.
all of those together probably make this.
Okay, so I think this is a good point as any to pivot to the main topic. Even though I can go down this rabbit hole even more, but we're here to talk about the Mighty Marvel Calendar Book, a visual history, which is on sale right now.
Do we need a
If you're
prop?
watching the
Here's a
YouTube,
prop if you're watching. Yeah.
yeah, if you're watching the YouTube version, my man Chris has got the book in hand, showing it off. For the audio listeners, I do have a link to the Amazon listing in the show notes. But I know I'm getting my copy through my local comic shop. I advise maybe you go support your local comic shop and get this book as well. But like I had said in the intro, it's a glorious hardcover book. I cannot wait to get my copy in the mail by the time this episode comes out, or from my shop. By the time this episode comes out, I will hopefully be enjoying mine in my hand. But you were kind enough to send me an advance review copy, a PDF copy, and just the digital version. I know anytime that I love a digital version, I know I'm gonna love the physical. And it's coming out through Abrams, which has got a high reputation for putting out some amazing books like this. So I guess let's just start off with the basics. How did this book come about? In your words, what is it about?
I mean, it came about first when I was a kid. Like I had some of these calendars. My older brother had some of these calendars. And so I would see these on the wall and I'm like, God, I love those calendars so much. Because unlike most calendars, which were always just like sort of a generic piece of art and then a
Hmm.
white grid of squares, that may be listed, I don't know, a couple holidays or like daylight savings time and stuff like that. Like Marvel treated every bit of the calendar, like cover to cover, as a piece of art in the way they treated their comics the same way. And so the calendar grid became these things where every square had like a bit of information, a quote from a comic or a bit of trivia about that old comic. It had early picture creators, which when I was a kid, like I didn't know who anybody was or what they looked like, and so these little black and white pictures were the only time you saw what anybody that made the comics looked like, and it just all of it together just became this like cool artifact that even sort of after the calendars expired, like every now and again, every 6, 7 years, whatever it was, the calendars would line up again, like the day and date would line up again. So I'd hang them on my wall all over again. So at IDW, like I wanted to do a book based on these because I never saw them reprinted. I'm like, there's a ton of great art in there, like Bill
Oh
Sienkiewicz
yeah,
and Jack Kirby and John Byrne and like Frank Miller and George Perez, like on and on and on, all these great
just
artists.
a murderer's row of the all-time greats. Like like Mount Rushmore galore when you think of like great comic book artists.
Yeah, and so it's always like, well, why have the world not seen these things? Why are they not reissued or somehow collected? And So I tried to get that done at IDW, and it didn't work for various reasons. Part of it was just the reproduction was challenging because those old
Hmm.
calendars are spiral bound, and you either had to tear it apart, which then risked tearing the. Anyway, the production end of it was a challenge. So I worked with a guy named David Banks who helped me do like the scanning, the restoration, and the cleanup and everything. And so we didn't do cleanup in that we didn't change the colors to modern. Like we made sure that we kept the look and feel of the old calendars, but just made them look like the best possible versions of them. The greatest thing about it is we produced them at the size they were made, and so they were 12 by 12 calendars, and so the book is this like 13 by 13
Yeah, it's a beast.
hardcover behemoth. Like it's like getting a large pizza, it's but but it weighs 10 pounds.
Yeah,
Like it's a
it's not as
heavy.
tasty.
Yeah, right. Although there's some tasty stuff in there, I got to say, like.
For sure. Yeah, for the
And
eyeballs. Yeah.
I unearthed all this old like behind the scenes stuff too, like these old memos and letters from the
Mhm.
staff to Stan Lee, or the process stuff, or
And
you
you
know,
know,
th-
you said something about, I'm sorry, no, you said something about this being an artifact, and I literally have a note here that it feels like I'm looking at a pop art art like a pop art artifact. And I mean that in the most respectful way, considering, the sometimes the negative connotations that come with pop art, but it feels like I'm looking at this artifact that is teleporting me and giving me so much insight into the mind of, editorial. And it almost treats like I'm looking at Marvel as like an art house with through reading this book, right? Like, yeah, I know now the general process of how a comic book is made, and the different hands it goes through. But this is interesting to get the behind the scenes story, because this isn't so, especially when you think about 1975 is the first calendar that came out. Like, there is no template to follow. So to get
and
like
no
the behind the
computers, so they're
that too,
cutting this
yeah.
stuff up. Like the manual production work to make these things seems so like lopsided versus you would look at that today on like a P&L, and you'd be like, I don't know, the amount of hours it's going to take to make this, the amount of money we're going to make doesn't,
Yeah,
we can't justify it. But
well
I don't
said.
think they were just like, let's make something cool. And
Exactly.
so like some of the stuff I found, and like this doesn't help the people that are just listening to the audio, but I have these like hand drawn pieces that the original editors that worked on the calendar did, where they drew
Wow.
out, by hand what they wanted the art to look like, then handed it to an artist. But they also drew every single square of every single month, by hand, what
Holy
they
shit.
wanted. Yeah. And so
And
then
and
the
it-
production
the first
department had to
editor,
go.
and is this from Roy Thomas? Because I know he did
This
the
is from
first.
David Anthony Kraft, who did the 78
Okay,
and
okay,
79 calendars. But I mean,
got it.
he did every single month to this elaborate degree of detail by hand. And so the cool thing is that we've got some of those
That's
reproduced in the
awesome.
back of the book. So you can see just the amount of care and time, and like what a massive labor of love these things were back then.
Well said. Labor of love is a great way to put it, and such a big flex, just like brand design, especially like design wise. Some of these designs and layouts, compositions, the color combinations, like still hold up so strong. And I think it's just a testament to just how good the art was. The caliber of artists at the time. I think the timelessness of these character designs, and just how iconic they are, and how they work so well in the hands of, like, the artists, and the right, I don't know. It is a lesson in just like design creativity 101.
Yeah, it was just they were just trying stuff. I think that's the exciting thing, is like they just tried stuff and it worked for the most part.
And and something you said too about like how these calendars stand out, aside from like obviously the art, but the personality that's injected in them, right? Like the decision by Roy Thomas in that first calendar to, like you said, do something with the actual dates, like to inject the personality of the bullpen. Like, hey, on this date is whatever, John Buscema's birthday, and oh, Jack Kirby, did this on this day, or Fantastic Four issue 12 came out. Like that is such a, it's just kind of, it's like a vehicle for the ethos of the Marvel bullpen at the time. And like all the things that you liked about Marvel, well, I guess I can only imagine. I wasn't, I was a kid, not even probably born then. Yeah, I wasn't even born then. But it was like a vehicle of why I think Marvel was succeeded so well in the 70s, was because of like the personality they had, like the cool factor.
Yeah, so yes, and that totally comes through. Like the humor, and I mean, some of it's like it feels like daddy humor, like it's goofy jokes or like these puns
Yes.
and these grown
Yeah,
worthy sort of comments.
I
But
agree.
the thing that they
The
really had
effort.
honed at
Yeah.
that point, yeah. But also like years ago, I tried doing this with the Hasbro because eventually we had like My Little Pony and Rom and Micronauts and GI Joe and Transformers. I'm like, all right, that's enough properties that we could make a Hasbro version of these old Marvel calendars. And so I started working on it, and I was just like, not only is this a colossal amount of work that was hard to like find time to do, but also like finding that right sense of humor that was sort of funny and engaging, but also wasn't insulting or didn't sort of mock the brands. Like it's such a fine line that they drew, and it's a very specific tone that they struck that was self-deprecating but not
Yes.
mocking. And so yeah, just everything about it just impresses me that they just created this thing that didn't exist and made it by hand, and then their production department got to work cutting out images and pasting stuff up and making these cool things that finally we can like show to people to remind them how good they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I want to share something with you because I got excited about. I think I had emailed you, and I was like, Chris, I just realized that the book I pre-ordered is written by you. And what you don't know is that last year I had met a comic seller, a comic collector here in Jacksonville, and his name is Tony. I cannot forget his last name. He's since moved from Jax, I think, to somewhere else, but he's always at Heroes Con, and he has some of the coolest just like comic things. Aside from like a bunch of back issues, he's got things like, Epic magazine and, a bunch of like old comic fanzines. But and then he also has like like the Merry Marvel marching band box kit and old things like that. But among those things that he had last year was these Marvel calendars. And that was my first like,
Wow.
oh wow, these are epic. So I went ahead and grabbed the one that I bought from him. And it
You
is
got the
the
goofiest one of all.
Because can I say that reading through this book, I'm like, damn, I should have tried to look for the 75 one. Damn, I really want these other, but now I'm on this quest to search for these other ones. But the one that I currently own, and I'm holding it up for the video listeners, for the video viewers, is the 1976 calendar, which was the bicentennial calendar. So everything inside of this calendar is themed around America and the Revolution and etc. And I was curious because I got to this chapter in the book, but I said, you know what? I'm gonna hold off on this. I want to be surprised when I ask Chris this. What can you
Hmm.
tell me about this particular calendar? Any fun facts or how it came to be or anything that might be cool to hear?
Yeah, so I mean, in 1976, yeah, so that was America's 200th birthday. So they were doing all these celebratory things. Like Jack Kirby was back on Captain America, and so they did this like Cap's Bicentennial Battles, big oversized Treasury edition that Jack put together. And so this was also trying to celebrate that bicentennial. So what they did was they dropped Marvel characters into the Revolutionary War. So every image in that calendar is like, I don't know, carry like the Hulk stomping around Gettysburg, or the Avengers crossing the Potomac with Washington, or whatever the case may be. It was just like some of the goofiest things, like Black Panther, from Africa is now fighting in the Marvel or America's Revolutionary War, and it's like
Yeah.
it's so anachronistic and everything. The funny thing
Mm.
is, so I talked to Tony Isabella, who's the writer and the editor who put that calendar together, and he goes, "Oh man, there's probably stuff in there that I don't want to revisit. Like it's probably embarrassing, or
Yeah.
it's probably culturally
Yeah,
made
just didn't age
references and
well.
things that
Yeah.
yeah. So it's such an artifact of its time. Um, but just like I don't know, seeing the Hulk and like in Valley Forge and like shredded revolutionary garb and stuff like that is, I don't know, the images are like not only great because of the artists involved, but also just so silly and such a moment in time that yeah, that one above all else like stands out as just this thing that you'll never see happen again.
I think maybe that's why Tony sold it to me for so cheap. Well, yeah, I can't wait to buy some of these other. The fun fact for those that maybe are going on eBay right now, looking up some of these old calendars, the originals are, depending on which one you get, kind of run you up, $50 on up. But fun fact, they're actually re-releasing I think 1975, the very first Mighty Marvel calendar for a 2025 edition. I think it come January, if I'm not mistaken. You got
It's
any info on
actually
that?
out now. They came out last
Oh,
summer. So, but the dates,
bet.
the 1975 dates do line up with 2025. So when I was doing the book, I was talking to Abrams. I go, hey guys, the dates
That's
match. You could
genius.
reissue. And so they got all excited about it. So they reissued the actual calendar. They gave it the
Okay,
spiral binding and everything that the old one had. And
awesome.
so, yeah, you can hang the old one on your wall and, you know what day and date it is accurately.
Okay, so among the offerings of the book, so aside from a very good looking book, well laid out, well designed book. I think we mentioned there is behind the scenes stories, there is, infographics, there's everything you would want to know about these calendars, as well as like what was going on with Marvel at the time. There's just a lot. This book is chock full of that information. But one thing I want to highlight is that it comes with a foreword by Roy Thomas, who, legendary Marvel editor, writer, Marvel historian at that. Talk about a professional historian. That's like the man when it comes to Marvel history.
Yeah.
And I was curious from your perspective, a fellow editor yourself, writer, etc. What was it like working with Roy? Like, what did you learn from him? What was it like having him, like, share these stories and have him walk down, memory lane when it comes to this?
Yeah, I mean, so Roy was the first writer editor on this calendar, so it was basically his idea. Well, I'm assuming it was his idea. I mean, there are things that
Mm-hmm.
Roy has talked about his involvement in the creation of various things. There's been various controversies associated
Yeah,
with some of those claims, but
the
on this
lines
one,
get
like
blurred sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, and so and it's hard to know fact from fiction at times, but in this one, like he was the writer editor of the calendar, so like to have him, you know, talk about I don't know Marvel at the time, and like he was the editor in chief at the time, and just the guy that got it all started was very exciting that he's still around to share his experiences and do the introduction and sort of talk about all the behind the scenes stuff in the making of that calendar. Was a thrill. Like Roy was one of the very first comic writers that I ever read as a kid. Like I love his stuff. And so, on a book like this, it was important that, the guy that got it all started was also asked to participate in the book that sort of celebrated what he got started.
Now, what would you say is your? Actually, you know what? I want to ask that because I have someone else to ask this. We're gonna take just a slight turn. We're gonna take a quick little detour.
Interesting.
Chris, for you, I have decided. I've done this before, but I actually am naming this segment. We're gonna go into a segment I'm now dubbing the Ghosts from Shortbox Pass. So this will be a
Man.
segment I do on interviews like this, where I reach out to past guests, friends of the show, and Shortbox alumni to call in their show to ask questions and hang out in spirit. They can't be here physically, but they can hang out in spirit. And I have two ghosts from Shortbox Pass from you. The first one, I'm not even going to ruin the surprise. Let's just play these voice messages I got, and there's some questions for you to follow up. And I think this one is related to the Mighty Marvel calendar. So here we go.
I love it.
This is a voice from your present, Chris Ryall. It's Ian. Hey, man. I had something really clever to say, but it got away from me. Something about the head leader of Galador requesting that you return home to suit up for Space Knight duty to fight the Dire Wraiths. But again, it got away from me, so I'm going to leave you this kind of lame message. Hey, I am glad that you hooked up with Batter and the crew on the Shortbox podcast. Great team. And hey, just wanted to say hello, and you are a pleasure to work with, my man. And I look forward to working on many projects moving forward. Great plans, great things ahead. Peace.
All right.
Wow.
For those
Okay, so he brought that one home at the end. I like it.
yeah. No.
Ian's awesome.
A little ROM reference too. Come on, a little ROM reference for you. Now, for those that might not be familiar, that was Ian Chalgren. I had him on the show last October on episode 407. We had him to come on to talk about an art book that he was working on at the time. It was the Uncanny Covers Ocular Edition. Since then, he has gone on to be a really badass designer. And for those watching video, Chris is holding up a book that Ian and Chris worked on together called The Origins of Marvel Comics by Stan Lee, which I guess, Chris, you do the honors. What exactly is that book? What was it like working with Ian, who's, relatively still like young in terms of like comic industry terms, but one hell of an eye when it comes to design and
One
graphics.
hell of an eye. Like, he's so good. And it's funny, I only got to know him because he sent me like a book that he mocked up out of the blue, knowing that I love ROM. Like years ago, he sent me just as
That's
proof of
right. The Sal
concept as a
Buscema book,
designer.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was great. And so I've been wanting to find ways to work with him. So once I left IDW and started the imprint at Image, like then there was finally some opportunities, and we've been doing more and more books and more archival books and more sort of high end cool stuff like you say, this Marvel Comics book, which so this was another thing, like the calendars, that when I was a kid, this was a book that just like I read it constantly. It was it basically featured origin stories of sort of all the big Marvel characters at the time. So it was Spider-Man, Hulk, Thor, Doctor Strange, Fantastic Four, all in one book. And it was the very first time Marvel's comics had ever been collected in like a nice bookstore library edition. So as a kid, you could go to the library, find this book, and just read it incessantly. And so for years, I'd wanted to bring that book back into print too, and finally got a chance to do that through Simon and Schuster's gallery line. So Ian was my designer, Alex Ross did the cover, and we brought in like all kinds of essays and other contributors to do cool pieces that talk about the book, like Larry Lieber, who worked on the first issue of Thor alongside Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The book's original editor, Alex Ross, did a couple pieces. Tom Brevoort, like it was just a blast to put together and include, kind of like the calendar book, all this like behind the scenes and backup material, just to flesh out the contents of the original book itself.
Yeah, how much of this stuff did you already know? Like going into that book or that book or the Mighty Marvel calendar, like how much of this was already in your head? How much of this history did you already commit to memory, or versus like how much, or did you have to do a lot of research and digging through books?
I did a lot of research just to not only make sure that my facts are accurate, because I have a lot of just stuff lodged in my head from decades of reading this stuff. But you want to make sure that you're accurate in the art credits and the things you're saying about the books, or sort of the stories you've heard from others along the way, that you want to sort of verify their accuracy and all of that. And so yeah, I did deep dives on everything, finding the all the letters and memos, like a lot of that stuff I'd never seen before. Certainly the hand-drawn sketches and stuff like that I'd never seen before. And so yeah, it's fun when you can just kind of dig in on your own, but then also when you tell certain people that are in the business or that know this stuff, then they start offering up help or offering up other people that know things, and it just kind of becomes like this whisper network of people that can help sort of flesh out all the behind the scenes details.
Okay. Now I have one more. Well, not one more. I actually have technically 3 voice messages from this one particular ghost of Shortbox Past, and I'm very excited for you to hear this one. So let's play his first voice message / question, which I think actually ties to the Mighty Marvel calendar. I mixed it up with Ian, but here we go.
I have a few questions for crazy comic columnist Chris Ryall. First, what's your favorite month in the calendar, and why?
Now, Chris, for those that might not be familiar with that voice right there, because I don't think he states his name, can you tell us who that is?
That was none other than Locke Key co-creator Joe Hill, who's done a great many things other than Locke Key, but that was where I first met him anyway. So yeah, that's the great Joe Hill. So that was very nice of him to ask that question, and the answer has to be October in all those calendars, because October, and I think just about every one of them, maybe not 1981, they did like a cool Halloween scene. So you got, I don't know, a Gene Colan Dracula piece. You got Mike Ploog drawing like all the Marvel monsters. And so there's a George Perez Spider-Man sort of surrounded by all of his villains with the moon large in the background. And so every October, there's like this cool Halloween themed piece in each of the calendars. And so that was the one that, as a kid and as an adult, always stood out to me the most.
Chris, I'm gonna put you on the spot here, but we keep bringing up all these like iconic artists and these illustrations. If you had to make a Mount Rushmore of your all-time favorite comic artists, who would be on there? What 4 comic artists come to mind?
God. Well, so there'd be multiple Mount Rushmores, because they're the people that like the foundational people in the business, like Jack Kirby, who that's a whole separate and higher, that's like Mount Olympus.
Well said. I
So
like.
not,
I might have to actually borrow
right?
that going forward. That's a good one. Who's on the Mount
Yeah,
Olympus?
so
Okay.
that's the pantheon. But I wouldn't
Sure.
necessarily pick those guys as my childhood favorites because they weren't the people I read first, and so it was the people that like really resonated to me as a kid. So that was very quickly. I can name two. John Byrne and George Perez were the first two guys that like I looked at their stuff and I could tell something about what they were doing was different and better than a lot of the other guys. You know, even before I knew to recognize creator names or knew that different people drew these things, there was something about like I'd read one of their old comics and be like, yeah, there's something here that stands out in ways that others don't. And so they're certainly on there. I would have to put Bill Sienkiewicz on there as a guy that opened my eyes and like the entire industry's eyes when he started to that comics could be something different. You know, like what he was doing was so different and unique and cool and just, I don't know, outside the lines of what you thought comics could be. That he'd be on that list or he'd be on that mountain anyway. And it's funny because now my fourth person is actually like a 3 or 4 headed monster on his own. But rather than cheating that way, I'll say it has to be Sergio Aragonés,
Nice.
who, you know, from my earliest days of reading Mad Magazine and then grew The Wanderer and everything, like just that guy and what he's done and how quickly he's done it and how prolifically he's done it. And just what a great guy he is too. Like just sort of one of the all-time spirits of comics, like just one of the best people ever to work in this business. I think he's also got to be up there. Which leaves out so many others. Like, you know, Neil Adams, I think, would be on the Olympus, not the Rushmore and all of that. And so there's, like they say, there's a lot of mountains, but probably those 4 would be, you know, on my Rushmore anyway.
No, solid list and great justifications at that. All right, let's get back to Joe Hill's questions. He's got 2 more for me. Let me go ahead and cue up the second one.
Okay, next question. Who would win in a fight? John Romita Sr.'s Spider-Man or Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man?
Huh. I mean, Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man could contort his body in unnatural ways, and so I think maybe he'd be harder to beat for that reason. But I don't know. Romita's Spider-Man was bulky, you know, like
right.
Ditko's was the spidery, you know,
stringy.
weird athletic. Yeah, but then Romita's like, well, wait, when did he get so thick? You know, it was like
looking through the calendar book, you realize, especially when it comes to like Romita and like Buscema, there is something about just how much mass their figures have. Like,
yeah,
you look at those their drawings, and you're like, no, that guy could definitely bench, you know, 500 pounds. You know, you like the tonality, the muscle mass. Like, I'm edging a little more towards John Romita Senior Spider-Man, because I feel like once he has a hold of McFarlane's Spider-Man, it's a wrap. You know, McFarlane's Spider-Man might be a little more agile, but I don't know if he can pack that same punch.
Yeah, no. McFarlane's is more like Vince Vaughn in Swingers, or you know. But then the Romita's is like Vince Vaughn and I don't know, Wedding Crashers or whatever. You know, he's like he's just thicker and plus the Peter Parker back then rode a motorcycle, so he was probably at his relative coolest at that point. So I think you got to go with Romita. Yeah.
Yeah, and his best looking too. No offense to McFarlane Spider-Man or Peter Parker, but you know, Romita Senior's Peter Parker was a damn movie star model and still broke. But
however,
anyways,
McFarlane's webbing could beat Romita's webbing, so you know it's almost a wash.
I'll concede to that. Yeah. All right. Last but not least, one more question from our friend Joe Hill. Here we go.
Finally, who had the better sleaze stash? 70s era Burt Reynolds, 70s era Tony Stark, or 70s era Stan Lee?
Oh, I mean, it's...
When I tell you, real quick, Chris, I thought, you know, I reached out to Joe and Ian. Ian was like, hey, give me a couple of days. I want to think of something good. And I was like, oh, Joe, I was like, if Joe even responds, I'll be impressed. You know, if he even has time, I'll be impressed. It was the fastest turnaround I've ever had doing one of these like reach outs and segments. He had 3 questions lined up, ready to go. And I was like, has he always pondered these questions?
He's pondered it. I was going to say, he's obviously pondered the mustache thing. And so 70s Tony Stark it was like a little more penciled
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't quite as robust as it became later on. So I think he finishes third in that
For sure.
contest. Um, I think probably it's got to be Burt Reynolds, right? Because we don't totally know that Stan's mustache wasn't an add-on, like a gift with purchase with the toupee, right? Like the hair wasn't necessarily fully his own, and so maybe the mustache was just like an add-on gift with when he bought the toupee.
Scandalous.
So
Scandalous, Chris.
I'm just saying, people are saying that could be the case. I don't. It was probably real, but
Yeah.
I think Stan with a beard was tough to beat. But Stan with just a
Yeah.
mustache, like everybody loses to '70s Burt Reynolds. Like that guy was it in the '70s.
Yeah, he had, and his sleaze factor was through the roof. I mean,
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay, well said. Well, I want to go ahead and give a big shout out to Joe Hill and Ian Chalgren for submitting those questions and being a part of the now anointed Ghost from Shortbox Pass segment. And Chris, thank you so much for being.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess we're getting to a good, wrapping up point, but I've got one or two more questions for you. You know what? I'm not going to take another detour. I told you earlier that among getting ready for this episode and doing my research, I ended up reading Zombies versus Robots for the first time, which I mistakenly thought it was like a new series, right? Actually, let me take a step back because I can actually transition that a little easier. Okay. Chris, before I let you go, I want to transition to talking about what you got going on with Syzygy, the imprint that you started 2 years ago with highly acclaimed on one of my favorite comic artists out there, Ashley Wood. You guys have been releasing titles such as Zombies versus Robots. You've got Onyx, The Hollows, Tales of Suspense, and then I believe come next month, you guys are dropping a Christmas horror themed comic called Dread the Halls.
Yes,
and
correct.
I had a chance to tell you that getting ready for this episode, I ended up reading Zombies versus Robots Volume 1, the collected edition, for the first time, thinking that this was like a new book. I'm like, oh, Syzygy's only been around for 2 years. This is a pretty new book. Lo and behold, you guys have been writing. You and Ashley Wood have been doing Zombies versus Robots stories since like 2011, I think, or something like that.
No, 2006, even worse.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm obviously well behind, but man, can I just go ahead and say that is such a fun comic book. Like the premise is so. I mean, it's. I've been
it's
telling
stupid.
some friends.
It's quite stupid, right? Like,
it's stupid fun, my friend. You forgot that last part.
Yeah.
Stupid fun. I've been telling all my friends about it. And I'm like, it's exactly what's on the cover. Much like going to a gas station, buying an Arizona can of iced tea. The price is on the cover. You're getting exactly what Chris and Ashley are selling on the cover. It's Zombies versus Robots. But honestly, the premise is fun. I feel like your knack for dialogue, man, it's like very lean. It's very lean, but gets the point across. And then on top of like Ashley Wood's incredible art, like it's a really fun book, man. And I want to just hear about Syzygy and your words, like what makes Syzygy, your imprint, stand out from other imprints? Like what's the ethos when it comes to the comics that you guys put out and your creative process?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I think probably what I try to have brevity in any of the stories is because Ash's stuff is so beautiful. Like I don't want to cover what he's doing with, copious amounts of text, but also like the zombies don't talk. So that already immediately eliminates like half the characters in the book from having any dialogue. And yeah, we just didn't want to do any kind of like ponderous, heavy thing with zombies. Like, so we started this in 2006. Ash was, for a while, Ash is an Australian citizen, but he was living in San Diego. And so he was in IDW's offices and he goes, hey, why don't you write me something? And I go, all right, well, what do you like to draw? And he goes, I like to draw zombies, I like to draw robots. And so I go, oh, why don't we do zombies versus robots? Because it makes no sense. Like the zombies need human brains to eat. We basically set a world where there's no humans. There's one infant, but otherwise, at least in the first storyline, there's no humans. Robots basically have no purpose other than what they're programmed to do. And so we wanted a storyline where none of the characters, like the protagonists or antagonists, had a character arc. Like there was no movie in this. It was just like us having fun, which made it even more amusing that like Sony then tried to develop a film based on it, which was funny to us because we kind of set out to make an anti-filmable kind of comic. And so we never take ourselves too seriously. We just try to have fun with these things. And Ash makes everything I like envision on paper look so much better when he draws them. And so I'm completely just kind of riding his artistic coattails on this book. But we originally did it, like starting in 6 at IDW, but then we put out a new edition of the older stuff, but with a bunch of new stuff added to it.
That's probably what I read.
The Syzygy
okay.
imprint. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and
so
no, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, I was just saying we've done some other things too. We did a book called Doomed, where we did like old horror stories, kind of like in the vein of Creepy and Eerie magazine. And so, yeah, we're constantly trying to find new stuff to do together, and just hopefully keep having fun.
I guess, is it easier? Like, do you feel like what you're doing at Syzygy, like difficulty wise, is easier considering like you've got over 20 years of experience, like running a publishing company? Like, is it easier because it's an imprint, or is there still like that same, whatever, I guess, stress and whatnot that comes with the job?
It's so much harder, man. It is so much harder and more stressful.
How so?
At IDW, like there was a staff, so when stuff needed, like eventually, so I was employee number 7, but like when I left there, I was like overseeing like 70 people, and so there were marketing people, and there were business people, and there were production people, and now there's me, and there's Ash at times but Ash is drawing some of the stuff, but he's not necessarily handling any of the other parts of the publishing, and so like Image is there on the back end to help on that part, but it's so much more work, which makes it more gratifying, but also you're like, I wouldn't mind a little bit of help here and there. But the nice thing is, like, when you're asking about what sort of books we publish or what our sensibilities are, they are only stuff that we like, which is kind of a simple and not helpful answer to creators. Like when they go, what kind of pitches do you want? I'm like, I don't know, just stuff that like kind of matches what we do, which is sort of idiosyncratic, kind of off kilter. Like when we did Joe Hill's Reign with Zoe Thorogood, it was an art style that wasn't necessarily a style that we've used on any of other Joe's adaptations. But it fit the story perfectly. And of course, Zoe has since like exploded in comics, rightfully so.
Yes.
And so finding people like that are, very good at doing their own thing, but they're also very unique, so they don't look like anybody else's stuff, and they've got a particular point of view. And I don't know, again, it kind of comes back to like, would I be proud to have Ash Wood seeing this thing and wanting this thing published under his imprint? And so he's kind of my guiding light on all of this.
Yeah. All right, to kind of circle back to the Wikipedia, there was something on there that I wanted to follow up or ask about, or even see if it's real, but it mentions that Zombies vs. Robots was optioned by Sony Pictures for Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes with Mike Flanagan as director. Is that true? Is there any, I guess, update on that? Or are we going to get a Zombies vs. Robot movie or something?
Well, I don't know, but we did have Mike Flanagan for 5 minutes, Mike Flanagan. It was epic, Mike Flanagan. Right? Even then it was epic, but like since then he's certainly gone on to do all kinds of amazing things that we'll never get Mike Flanagan back on the project. But yeah, in 2010 they optioned it, which was amusing to us because again, we didn't really have a story there that was necessarily workable as a film. Like there's no human parts, there's maybe voice work, but a big live action movie needs human roles for it to work for the studio. And so they made considerable changes to it, some of which were fun, some of which I thought were getting so far away from the premise that it was not necessarily, you just wonder why they wanted Zombies versus Robots. But every time there was a different director attached, they bring in a new team, they rework the story a bit more. So it's gone through these different iterations. I don't know if it ever happens. It was originally envisioned as like this massive, $100 million plus trilogy kind of thing. And those kind of movies just don't get made anymore if it's not based on like a Marvel or DC property.
Yeah,
and so
something safe.
I think if it's a smaller scale thing, like a down and dirty kind of thing, there's ways to still do it. But I don't know. Like it's not dead. And I actually talked to one of the heads at Platinum Dunes just a few months ago who still wants to find a way to do it. So that's at least encouraging. But now we're just trying to figure out like, is there a way to do this that is true to what, they want it to be, what we would like it to
Mhm.
be. And I hope so. Like, I love that they're still interested in it. And, I'm also hopeful that eventually we get back to calling it Zombies vs. Robots again. Like, it was renamed early on, Inherit the Earth. And I was like, but like to your point earlier, like the title does your marketing for
Yeah,
you.
it's
Like,
the name. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll see.
Okay. I'll keep my fingers and toes crossed, but I will say as a late comer to Zombies versus Robots, the collection that's out there is awesome. So I'm glad
Thank
to
you.
have plenty of comic books to read. Um, let's go back, I guess, on the topic of comics, and we'll wrap up here with, about the Might of Marvel calendar. But I've gone on and talked about your accolades, the big first that you've had. You've shared, insight into what it takes to work with licensors and within the comic book space. And I guess, like, if you were given like a magic wand or a lamp, and you could change one thing about the comic book industry based on like your many years of being in it, like hands on, and a change that might be like for the better, I guess, what would you want to see change in the comic book industry?
Well, so a couple things. Well, probably more than a couple, but depends how much money I have then to fix it. But so I mean, part of it is like the two things that I always felt were my responsibility working in comics was to not only help elevate new talents and give new people opportunities that they didn't otherwise find, but also give back where I can, like
Hmm.
do the preservation of this stuff in these archival editions, or offer work to people that help build a lot of the great comics from years past, but aren't necessarily getting any kind of paying work now. And so on one front, I want that. I want to be able to like sort of help old and new keep making cool stuff and telling good stories. But the other part of it is, I don't know. I think there's a conversation that we, as a collective industry, don't want to have, which is finding ways to make it make sense in 24 to keep doing the kind of comics and the formats that we're doing.
Hmm.
And I get it, but it's weird because like I love, a simple 20-page story, 32-page comic book, because that's what I'm used to. But does a thing that's part one of six that costs $4 or $5 per chapter and is released one issue at a time over 6 months, does that work for today's audience? And I don't think in a large measure it doesn't. It's people that read them that way as kids maybe still like it that way, but like newer kids want a full book, they want a whole story. And so trying to figure out like the right way to present this material, but also the right places to present, like how do we make sure that kids who aren't necessarily reading comics now or going to comic book shops, how are they still getting fed this kind of material? Like once they've graduated from Dogman and Wimpy Kid, like what's the best way to remind them that graphic novels and sort of graphic storytelling is still a very viable thing for them to continue on with as they age? And so it's sort of that, like cultivating that next generation of readers that stick with it beyond childhood. And that's where I think it's getting to be more of a challenge outside of like webtoons, which then becomes hard for the creators of that material to actually make a
Hmm.
living at it. So it's like, how do we create an ecosystem where people are aware of these things, have access to them the way they want them now, but also in a way that's sustainable enough for the people making them? And there's probably no easy answer. And I think crowdfunding is probably a big part of that at this point too, beyond just the big publishers. So but we all kind of like dabble in things that we hope are the right answer, but without sort of collectively talking about like, maybe we should change doing monthly comics into something, but what is that something? And so like I say, I think there's no easy answers, but there's a conversation that I think needs to keep going on because I want comic stores to continue on too. And they certainly have a harder time because younger people aren't going in as much. And how do we help everybody sort of keep thriving in the way that people want to read stories nowadays?
That's really good food for thought, and I wish we had more time to like chew on that. But I want to ask you another question, and kind of in that semi same vein. But as I guess throughout your experience as like an editor in chief, and writer yourself, like what advice would you give to an aspiring comic creator, whether that be like a writer or an artist or just a creator in general, that And maybe this could be something about like, just common mistakes that you see or things from like that editor. I guess from an editor perspective, what is some advice that you would give to an aspiring comic creator that would help them maybe break into the industry or fortify, their own story and getting their, story out?
Yeah, I'd say so. There's a couple things. Like one is from a broader point of view, finish stuff when you start it. It's so easy to start things, and I think that's where some people go awry. Is they'll start drawing a thing or they'll start writing a thing, and then they get excited about their next idea. And I get that. And you want to jump onto this hot new thing that you're excited about, but then you don't finish that one, and then you don't finish the one before that, and suddenly you develop a bit of a track record of walking away from stuff, which just makes it hard to then finish something once you actually get hired to do that, if you do. And so the act of actually finishing a thing is one of the hardest things in making anything. And so even if you're not loving this thing, like you'll learn from it and you'll figure out next time like what to do to sort of improve upon what you did before. But you got to finish the thing to have like a good proof of concept to show publishers, to show fans, like to let people read your stuff, just not abandoning stuff because it's not working, but figuring out why it's not working and seeing it through. And then from a more sort of hands-on perspective, just making sure that what you're doing is readable. It's not too wordy. If you're an artist, making sure that you're not trying to dazzle so much in like crazy storytelling with panels going all which ways and characters breaking through panels and stuff like that to try to dazzle visually, but at sort of the sake of coherence. Like you want to make sure that your story still reads, linearly in the way you want people to like lead their eye and everything. And so just make sure that, what you're doing has enough coherence to it that if you hand it to somebody, whether it be just a friend or somebody online or an editor, they can easily read it and see what you're trying to do with that story and not, you know what I mean? Because sometimes people try so hard to do every cool visual trick on every page that you kind of lose the story underneath it. And then, so you find that balance of like, what's cool? When should I break the rules? But when should I also just make sure that I'm telling a story that other people can also follow, if that's your goal? Like sometimes your goal is just to have cool images and words placed around it, and that's also fine. And then for both of those groups, the biggest lesson is, like we talked earlier, like you don't need permission to make comics. Like, there's not an easy path into comics like there is with like being a doctor or lawyer. Not easy, but I mean, at least sort of straightforward. But the path in is to just make something, make a comic, and you work in the comic industry. Like you may not make a living at it yet, but that goes a long way to then showing people what you could do and then hopefully working your way up to finding that paying work. So just, make stuff and don't wait for somebody to tell you it's okay.
Well said. That's some valuable insight right there for our aspiring creators listening. Chris, this has been fantastic, man. And I'm looking at my list. I'm like, I could go on for a little longer, but I'm starving and I don't want to take up any more of your time. I want to give you one more chance to say anything, I guess, about the Mighty Marvel calendar. It's, like I said, for anyone listening, it's in stores right now. You can pick it up yourself. I highly recommend it. And if this whole entire hour plus interview and conversation has not convinced you to go pick up this book, let me share with you a quote that from someone that I absolutely think would persuade you if you are into comics or, respect the medium at all. These calendars showcase some of the greatest artwork ever done in comics. I've been waiting a long, long time for this book. Alex Ross.
Alex friggin' Ross. Yeah.
Exactly. If Alex Ross is co-signing the book, I don't know if there's anything more to be said, but Chris, do you want to add anything to that? Why should people go check out or pick up the Mighty Marvel calendar book?
I mean, in part, because it's a lot of this great art and great material that has just not been reprinted in decades. So mostly it's going to be new to you in ways that like a lot of these archival books aren't. Also because it was done through, like you say, Abrams Comic Arts and with the great editor Charlie Kochman. I work with a number of Charlie. Charlie Kochman is the editor on the book, and he's amazing, always produces these award-worthy books. And it is, just this huge, heavy, big, cool artifact that is also a great gift. And again, like it just showcases a point in history and a point in Marvel's history in particular that we just don't really see anymore. It's just a very special moment in time that I was just too happy to find a way to, bring back out into the world. And I hope, people find it as exciting as I did as a kid.
Ladies and gents, this is the Shortbox Podcast, and we just finished talking with Chris Ryall about his new book, The Mighty Marvel Calendar Book, A Visual History, which is available right now for all you diehard Marvel heads and aspiring and amateur Marvel historians to buy wherever you get your books, and probably at your local comic shop, right? Do me that favor. Go check if this book is available at your local comic shop. More than likely, they can order it. Go buy the book, all right? With that said, I'll have links to the book. I'll have links to where you can follow Chris online in the show notes. His Instagram is well worth a follow. You share some really cool photos and backstories and projects that you share. So I have that linked in the show notes. Please check that out if you're interested. Chris, any parting words, any shameless plugs before we wrap up?
Well, so the only other plug at this point, because we're pretty plugged out probably, but I run a like weekly-ish Substack where I also talk about old comics, new comics, and other things in between. And so there's that. But otherwise, the only parting words are a thank you to you, and also to Joe and to Ian for calling in and participating. That was great. So really enjoyed talking to you today. That was fantastic, man. Thank you.
Well said. No, the pleasure was on mine. We'll have to have you on for a part 2. I'll be on the lookout for more releases from Syzygy.